One of the most stunningly impressive hostage rescue missions ever conducted happened in the Republic of Colombia in July of 2008. It was a dangerous Tier 1 level operation that risked the lives of every member of the team that conducted the rescue. Prior to execution, it was so classified and compartmented that only the smallest group even knew it existed. It was a complex deception operation with almost too many moving parts, attempting to rescue hostages held deep in the jungles of Colombia by a ruthless narco terrorist organization that sought to overthrow the government of Colombia. On February 13, 2003, a single-engine Cessna 208B Grand Caravan flew over the Cordillera Oriental mountain range south of Bogota, Colombia. The aircraft belonged to Southcom Reconnaissance Systems, a subsidiary of Northrop Grumman, and was contracted by the U.S. Department of Defense. It was conducting aerial surveillance of cocoa-producing areas to locate and identify cocoa fields and drug processing labs within the thick triple canopy jungles of Colombia. The crew of the aircraft consisted of the pilot, Tom Janis, a retired Army Chief Warrant Officer helicopter pilot and Vietnam veteran, Tom Howes, the co-pilot with 13,000 hours, Keith Stansel, a former Marine and intelligence analyst, Marc Gonsalves, a former Air Force intelligence analyst and FLIR technician, and Sergeant Luis Alcides Cruz, an observer from the Colombian Army. When the steady drone of the engine faded, Janis calmly declared, "That, sir, is an engine failure." The only sound was the quiet rushing of air past the cockpit windows. Janis immediately began looking for an area to land, while Stansel contacted the U.S. Embassy. Howes was checking the map to see if they could reach their refueling site at Larandia. Looking at their current altitude of 12,000 feet, he quickly realized that based on speed and rate of descent, they were not going to make it over the ridgeline to Larandia. Janis expertly glided towards a clearing that seemed to get smaller the closer it got. Stansel passed their location to Ed Trinidad at the embassy and asked him to make sure to tell their families that they loved them. Stansel remembered skipping some survival training offered by his company, as he believed no one would survive a crash landing in the piece of shit aircraft they'd been asked to fly in. Stansel also contacted the two nearest airports at Florencia and Larandia and alerted them to their situation. Just before landing, they tried one more time to restart the engine, but it failed to wind up. Tom Janis banked the aircraft left, the stall warning sounded, and he banked right. There was a crash of tearing metal, and then a harder crash as the aircraft bounced along the side of the sloped rocky clearing, ripping off the landing gear. A third impact tore holes in the cockpit, and the aircraft came to a stop at the edge of a sheer cliff. Stansel and Cruz kicked and shouldered the door open, and three were able to exit the wreckage, which had stopped at the edge of a sheer cliff. From outside, Howes, looking at Janis still jammed in his pilot seat, feared he was dead, as there was blood everywhere. Howes began banging on the plexiglass, calling Tommy, hoping to rouse him, but over his own shouting he heard gunshots and Cruz yelling, "FARC! FARC! FARC!" The men who had escaped pulled the last two men out of the wreckage and took cover near the fuselage, crouching below rounds snapping through the air. Though Janis was alive, the situation was quickly deteriorating. FARC stood for Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias de Colombia, or Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia. They were a Marxist-Leninist guerrilla group that was mostly a narco-terrorist organization, as they had to go the criminal capitalist path in order to fund their organization. So in addition to narco-trafficking, they kidnapped for ransom, did illegal mining, and extorted the locals. So perhaps narco-terrorist organized crime syndicate is a better description. FARC concentrated on the northwestern, southwestern, and eastern areas of Colombia. They were the largest of the three terrorist organizations that afflicted the government of Colombia, and it was they who controlled the cocoa fields and cocaine production facilities that these SRS contractors were looking for. At the wreckage site, a few FARC guerrillas were coming up the hill towards them, and an entire platoon were coming down the hill from above them, firing as they moved. Cruz handed Stansel the bag that contained pistols for self-protection. Stansell quickly tossed them down the hill. The few pistols and one M4 rifle were not enough against the numbers of guerrillas they saw. It would only get them killed. Cruz realized that he was in more danger because although he was dressed in civilian clothes, he was a Colombian military. "Please say that I'm an American. Please tell them," he asked. Stansell readily agreed and watched as Cruz limped away to bury incriminating papers. None of them seemed to be in any pain, but Stansell realized that all of them were hyped up on adrenaline. The pain from their injuries would soon show itself. GONSALVES crawled back into the wreckage to destroy their target deck. Janis was still groggy, but Stansell thanked him for the epic landing. As bad as the situation was, it was a miracle they were alive, and it was all due to Janis's superb skills as a pilot. Tom Howes also had a bad head wound, a flap of skin hanging and blood still pouring down his face. "No armas, no armas," Stansell cried out as about 60 heavily armed guerrillas approached. Stansell and Howes were immediately taken down the hill about 50 meters from the wreck. Up the hill, they watched a female guerrilla search the wreckage. Her name was Sonia, and she was their leader. Guerrillas directed GONSALVES to head down the hill toward Stansell and Howe. The three of them looked up the hill to see the injured Janis put his arm around Sergeant Cruz. It was the last they saw of them. Sonia would later brag that she killed both. Within 30 minutes, Stansell, GONSALVES, and Howe were strip-searched for microchips because the FARC teenagers controlling them were the typical Marxists, ignorant, uneducated, and naive. Peasant communists with no concept of how the world really worked. Once dressed, they heard the approach of UH-1 Iroquois helicopters. The Colombian Army helicopters began engaging FARC operatives they could see on the ground. In fact, at one point, the Colombian gunners recognized the Americans but could do nothing for fear of hitting them. They had no troops to land, only machine guns and miniguns, and they didn't want to risk the lives of the hostages. It was the last time they had any friendly eyes on them for over 5 years. This was not the last time either the Americans or the Colombians tried to locate these three men. In fact, for the Colombians, these Americans disappeared into a terrorist organization that kidnapped for money. At any given time, the FARC held over 500 hostages, the vast majority of whom were either Colombian police officers or Colombian soldiers. The 2nd SRS Cessna Grand Caravan was pressed into service, searching the area where their 5 co-workers disappeared. On 25 March 2003, it clipped a tree and crashed in a ravine, killing all 3 on board. It was the end of the SRS effort. Then news from around the world pushed their plight from the headlines. Operation Iraqi Freedom started 1 month later, while Operation Enduring Freedom continued in both Afghanistan and the Philippines. Neither Southcom in Miami, Florida, or SOC South at Homestead Air Force Base, Florida, forgot, but lacking good locating data, the best they could do was leaflet drops over the vast jungles of Colombia. In May of 2003, a Colombian Special Operations Force attempted a daylight rescue mission of another group of hostages by fast-roping from UH-60 Blackhawks directly onto a known FARC camp. FARC heard the approach, and before the Colombian SOF had hit the ground, FARC had executed 9 prisoners and wounded 3 more, one of them mortally. Only 1 hostage was untouched. The failure was heartbreaking, and President of Colombia, Álvaro Uribe Vélez, took full responsibility, an example that American presidents could learn from. From this point on, approvals for direct action missions to rescue hostages would be very difficult to come by. The first proof of life happened in July of 2003, 5 months after their capture, when Colombian journalist Jorge Enrique Botero was allowed to videotape interviews with the captured Americans and former Senator and presidential candidate Ingrid Betancourt Pulicio and her campaign manager / vice presidential running mate Clara Leticia Rojas Gonzalez. These 2 women had been captured a year earlier than the Americans. So much for campaigning in the demilitarized zone of Colombia. Colombian SIGINT intercepts indicated that FARC had increased their security measures and directed all commanders holding hostages to execute them if rescue was imminent. In fact, 2 FARC elements accidentally met and had an unfriendly fire incident, and all hostages were executed. After the failed daylight rescue, Colombian SOF focused on high-value targets to disrupt FARC's command and control. General Vance J. Craddock, Southcom's commander, along with the newly appointed ambassador to Colombia, William B. Wood, pushed for more integration of U.S. SOF to participate in non-combat sensitive site exploitation on HVT camps targeted by KULICH. This was approved in May 2005, and Brigadier General Cleveland, commander of SOC South, leveraged his authorities with the Operation Willing Spirit execution order, along with NSPD 18 and Section 1208 of the National Defense Authorization Act, to build greater capacity and capability with the Colombian SOF units. This led to the authorization of embedding Army Special Forces personnel with KULICH reconnaissance teams working in FARC areas. In June of 2006, Colombian Army SIGINT intercepted a message that the FARC VIP hostage group with Ingrid Betancourt and the 3 Americans had been given permission to relocate to Yari province. Combined reconnaissance teams were launched to find this FARC unit, but without success. The problem was that the jungle was huge, mountainous, and triple canopy, meaning you could pass within 100 meters of someone and miss them entirely. Recce teams could not find this FARC unit, and human sources in that particular area were sparse. Then came a major break. In May 2007, Colombian Police Subintendente John F. Pinchao escaped after 9 years in captivity. He spent 17 days in the jungle evading his FARC pursuers and found some local villagers who took him to the local National Police Counter-Narcotics Jungle Commandos. As he had been held captive with Ingrid Betancourt and the 3 Americans, he was extensively debriefed on FARC hostage security procedures, physical condition of the hostages, and the general location of the prison camp, which FARC had abandoned after his escape. It also turned out that Ingrid Betancourt had borrowed a scalpel from one of the 3 Americans, and Pinchao had used it to pick the lock of the nightly chains he wore, allowing him to escape. A combined interagency SSE mission to that camp confirmed Pinchao's story. Most important, Colombian military and national police identified the FARC leader in charge of the VIP hostages as Cabecilla Subcomandante Gerardo Aguilar Ramirez, alias Cesar. By late 2007, General Mario Montoya Uribe, commander of the Colombian Army, fully understood that the 3 Americans and Ingrid Betancourt would be the last hostages ever released by the FARC. The nature of the mountainous area and the triple canopy jungle meant that traditional KULICH or even U.S. SOF direct action missions could be expected to have a very low chance of success. Speed, surprise, and violence of action were extremely problematic in the thick jungles of Colombia. Someone had to think completely out of the box. That person was a young cryptoanalyst sergeant in the Colombian Army whose loco idea was inspired by both an unlikely source and from major changes within the leadership of FARC. The unlikely source was socialist dictator Hugo Chavez of Venezuela. Chavez had negotiated with FARC for the release of a number of hostages, one of which included Clara Leticia Rojas, the Colombian vice presidential candidate who had been taken hostage with her running mate, Senator Ingrid Betancourt. Rojas had become pregnant in captivity by a FARC guerrilla and gave birth to a son, suffering from Stockholm Syndrome. Her son Emmanuel, suffering from malnutrition, a broken arm, and other illnesses, had been given up months earlier to local peasants who took him to a hospital. Rojas was released on 10 January 2008 by Venezuelan-sponsored Red Cross helicopters that landed near a FARC camp in the jungle and transported her and other hostages to freedom. The second incident that inspired the idea was major changes within the FARC leadership, the first of which was the death of Luis Edgar Divia Silva, alias Paul Reyes, a FARC Secretariat member and advisor to FARC's Southern Bloc, the most prolific cocaine bloc of FARC. Colombian security forces attacked his narco terrorist camp on March 1, 2008, and the dumbass stepped on one of his own landmines running away. This raid actually happened a mile across the border in Ecuador, who whined about their territorial integrity after assuring Colombians there were no FARC in Ecuador. Venezuela also whined about the innocent FARC freedom fighters killed by Colombia, but neither country did anything about it. Only days later, Manuel Jesus Munoz Ortiz, alias Ivan Rios, commander of FARC's Central Bloc, was killed by his own security chief, Pablo Montoya, to collect the reward offered by the Colombian government. Montoya presented a severed right hand as proof of his claim, and it is unclear if he received the $5 million reward, but my bet is he did. But the major incident was the reported death of Pedro Antonio Marin, alias Manuel Marilandia Velez, a.k.a. Tirofillo, Sure Shot, the founder and supreme leader of the FARC, probably of natural causes. He was duly replaced by his second-in-command, Leon Sáenz Vargas, alias Alfonso Cano. It was the two humanitarian hostage releases in early 2008, sponsored by the Venezuelan government, and the FARC leadership shakeup that gave the young Colombian Army cryptoanalyst who worked in the electronic warfare signals intelligence company a brilliant and perhaps outrageous idea. He told his commander, "We have the capacity to dupe the FARC into collecting the VIP hostages to attend an international propaganda video with their new commander, Alfonso Cano. The Venezuelans convinced them to release some hostages for humanitarian reasons earlier. Instead of just reacting to FARC-directed hostage moves, let's take control of their communications and order them to relocate them where they could be rescued." The commander listened intently and knew that their EW SIGINT company was the only consistent, reliable intelligence on the FARC. It was true. Kolar crypto analysts had successfully compromised FARC's communications for several months and were systematically cracking FARC codes. They knew all of their operating frequencies, knew all their radio operators by name, and though the FARC regularly changed their encryption, the Kolar EW SIGINT would crack it within days each time. There were 4 specific events that increased the confidence of the Colombians that they could pull this unbelievable concept off. First, sometime in 2005 or 2006, a Kolar deep undercover HUMINT asset had obtained a copy of FARC's 33rd Front codes long enough to photocopy them. Second, the April 2000 escape of National Police Officer Pinchao on the Apaporos River. His critical report that Ingrid Betancourt, the 3 Americans, and other VIP hostages were controlled by the FARC First Front Eastern Bloc and led by Gerardo Aguilar Ramirez, a.k.a. Cesar, focused Kolar's SIGINT collection. Third, the second American Proof of Life video was released in 2007. This was followed by the interception of a message from Cesar asking his Eastern Bloc commander for permission to move the VIP hostages into the Yari region. This focused recce teams to specific areas and launched a major Kolar offensive, Operation Ellipse, in the Yari region to both block FARC from moving into the Yari region or to observe them if they did slip by. As part of Operation Ellipse, Brigadier General Charles T. Cleveland, SOC South commander, forward deployed an in extremis direct action unit to Tolomedia. Suddenly, Tolomedia had more American Green Berets and SOAR 160 helicopters than Colombian soldiers. FARC recognized these Special Ops Black Ops and found some ground sensors and backed off their planned movement. Finally, fourth, on 16 February 2008, a Kolsov recce team reported eyes-on 3 white men speaking English and calling each other by name as they bathed in the Yapuri River, guarded by about 20 FARC guerrillas. The SIGINT company commander tested the ability of his intercept teams to infiltrate the FARC radio net between Cesar and his immediate superior, the FARC Eastern Bloc commander, Victor Julio Suarez Rojas, alias Jorge Vicino Suarez, a.k.a. Mono Jojoy, by sending a benign encrypted message to Cesar while jamming Mano Jojoy's female radio operator. "How is the cargo?" they asked, pretending to be from Mano Jojoy. They expected a delayed response because of FARC morning-afternoon transmission schedules and were surprised by an immediate fine from Cesar's RTO. The SIGINT company commander and his NCO took the proposition to Major Davila, the director of KULICH SIGINT analysis. Major Davila was skeptical and wanted more proof. A few days later, they brought back 2 more responses from Cesar. Major Davila was now a believer, but he needed money and authorities that could only be approved by his superiors, the Director of Technical Intelligence, Colonel Alano, and the KULICH G2, Brigadier General Ricardo Diaz Torres. They would need commercial radios identical to FARC radios, backstopping to cover all the movements necessary to conduct these clandestine broadcasts, compartmentation for operational security, and a secure jungle area for a radio base station. Colonel Alano and General Diaz brought the idea to General Montoya, the top commander of the Colombian Army. Only General Montoya had the full authority to control the funds and personnel to make this mission happen, but Montoya knew a mission this high risk had to be taken to the very top. His superior was General Freddy Padilla de Leon, commander of all of Colombia's armed forces, who saw the potential of this operation. General Padilla took it to Colombian Minister of Defense Juan Manuel Santos Calderon, who approved it immediately. Then it went to the President of Colombia, Alvaro Uribe Vélez. President Uribe took less than 24 hours to approve the operation. General Montoya immediately understood all the parts necessary to make such an audacious, outside-of-the-box mission happen, and the first of which was compartmentation. Officers known to leak information to journalists were out of the picture. Even American SOF forces were not in the loop. Normal PSYOPs missions and leaflet drops continued. Regular Colombian Army and U.S. SOF continued their searches for the hostages, not knowing a complex deception operation was being conducted by a select, highly compartmented COLSOF, SIGINT, and HUMINT operators. There were even compartments within this highly secretive compartment. Colonel Navas, the G2 HUMINT director, was responsible for recruiting, organizing, and training an all-volunteer recovery team with one exception. General Montoya already knew who he wanted to be the on-the-ground team leader for this op. Major Jose Luis Rusi Caballero was a deep cover operative intimately familiar with the FARC and the ELN. The ELN being the National Liberation Army, another Marxist-Leninist guerrilla insurgency group that were better classified as terrorists. In fact, as a spy, he had instigated a vicious firefight between the FARC and their supposed allies, the ELN, in a city contested by both. All night long, he traveled back and forth between the warring sides, making the battle worse for each, successfully pulling a Yojimbo like Clint Eastwood in A Fistful of Dollars. By morning, both sides were combat ineffective, and the Colombian Army moved in, liberating the entire city. Major Rusi was the perfect man for the mission. General Montoya would also select the crews for the 2 Soviet Mi-17 helicopters to be used. They were the oldest of 5 Mi-17s owned by Colombia, which had been purchased for air search and rescue. Now they would be repainted as if owned by a humanitarian agency. Major Navas handpicked the rest of the ground team, who would act either as international aid workers for a fake non-governmental organization or as a fake television news crew complete with video cameras. The SIGINT company commander and his NCO carefully crafted messages that would be inserted into the radio communications of the 2 pertinent FARC leaders, Mano Jojoy and Cesar. As both leaders had female RTOs, they searched for the best female operators that sounded like the FARC RTOs, Andrea, Mano Jojoy's, and India, Cesar. They selected these women from the secretarial pool within their organization. They also had to establish 2 remote radio locations, which ended up being 90 miles away by vehicle and foot from Bogota, as they needed an authentic insect and animal noises in the background for their new female RTOs. The Kolar SIGINT NCOs became familiar with the commercial radios employed by FARC and created a 10-day practical course for the secretaries to teach them how to be an RTO. They also received limited read-ons by Colonel Olano, so they could provide answers to any FARC questions within 24 hours. One advantage they had was that Mano Jojoy and Cesar had not met in over 3 years. By mid-April 2008, the two field SIGINT teams were up and running. The G2 Human Director was recruiting close to 15 personnel from all over the Colombian Army while providing each with plausible, backstopped reasons for being absent from their commands. These soldiers were identified based on their ability to fill the roles associated with civilian humanitarian missions, just like the two earlier Venezuelan missions. Colonel Navas had zero objections with Major Rusi's assignment as team leader, as he knew that Rusi had successfully completed a number of deep cover assignments. Major Rusi, a Colombian of Italian extraction, was intelligent, energetic, and a charismatic natural leader with good common sense. He volunteered without hesitation. Major Davila knew that one of the critical roles for the team was a television camera crew, and as he was very familiar with video production, he proposed himself for the role of a Telesur television cameraman to Colonel Navas. All he needed to do was gain some weight, as he looked too much like a fit military soldier. Navas readily agreed. As the team would also need medical personnel, they specifically chose operators with real medical background to portray the medics, doctors, and nurses that would be expected of a humanitarian mission. They also picked personnel that looked international, such as a Colombian officer of Lebanese descent who spoke fluent Arabic, and another raised in Australia who spoke good English. These two operators were directed to act as if they were ignorant of Spanish during the actual op. One unique operator was a former 16-year veteran of FARC, a vetted operative who had earned the Colombians' trust after numerous dangerous intelligence operations. This operative was very familiar with the FARC Eastern Bloc and would perform the role of representative of Leon Sáenz Vargas, alias Alfonso Cano, the commander of FARC. They also needed operatives with excellent hand-to-hand skills, as not a single member of the ground team would have a weapon. These men had to be able to subdue armed guerrillas who were physically tough after a lifetime of surviving in the jungle. Once the team was assembled, they were put into isolation and signed non-disclosure statements. The operation remained voluntary, but anyone who changed their mind would remain in seclusion until the operation was complete. Colonel Navas hired a professional acting coach to critique demeanor, confidence, and poise to eliminate any military posture, mannerisms, or styles of speech. Each operator had to stand before a murder board consisting of Generals Montoya and Diaz and Colonels Olano and Navas. The fraudulent non-governmental humanitarian organization was set up in a commercial office building in Bogota with an Italian as director. He employed dozens of secretaries, each answering multiple phones while recording all conversations. It was all part of backstopping the NGO itself and all the cover stories of the operators. A website was established with email and telephone numbers and was monitored daily to see who was visiting the site. They advertised the NGO on the radio and television, and even President Uribe endorsed their work in a public broadcast to add legitimacy. Then the SIGINT team got an unexpected challenge from Andrea, Mano Jojoy's RTO, after one of the jamming sessions caused temporary shutdowns of FARC communications. But bad weather and lazy FARC RTO procedures provided the SIGINT team with enough time to ask the correct FARC counterparts and get the right answers. After this hiccup, the SIGINT teams began coaxing Cesar to gather and move his VIP hostages closer to the area where the Venezuelans had conducted their humanitarian mission earlier in the year. But the closer they got to the op, the more worried General Montoya became that either unwitting COLSOF or US SOF elements might accidentally engage Cesar's element while they moved. Montoya recommended that Defense Minister Santos tell both U.S. Ambassador William R. Brownfield and Colonel Gregory Wilson, the SOC South Forward Commander. On 26 June 2008, Ambassador Brownfield and Colonel Wilson visited Santos's home and were apprised of the pending operation. 3 days later, President Uribe called President George W. Bush. Bush obviously did not want a firefight, but did ask President Uribe what he needed. Uribe requested that U.S. technical intelligence platforms would continue to be available. The Americans didn't know it, but D-Day was set for 1 July, only 2 days after President Uribe's talk with President Bush. The Kolar SIGINT teams had passed to Cesar 4 requirements needed by the humanitarian NGO prior to the pickup that would take Cesar and the VIP hostages to meet the new FARC Supreme Commander, Alfonso Cano. A radio frequency to contact FARC on the ground, a bonfire to mark the helicopter landing zone to determine wind direction. Hostages must wear white T-shirts. No rifles or guns will be brought aboard the humanitarian helicopters. These were similar to the requirements of the Venezuelan humanitarian missions, and Cesar agreed, but heavy rains dumped all over the proposed pickup site on 1 July. It was the second day of the Colombian national holiday, Feast of St. Peter and St. Paul. D-Day was pushed 24 hours. On the 2nd of July, the mission was a go, but they waited until confirmation was received from India, Cesar's RTO. That didn't happen until after 1400 hours. The Mi-17s with the rescue teams took off from Tolomedia and flew to San Jose Guaviare, and then headed on to their final destination, Cesar's camp along the Apaporos River in southern Guaviare province. There was a backup plan in case everything went south. A quick reaction force of KULICH and US SOF stood by, consisting of over 2,000 troops and 40 helicopters, blades spinning at Tolomedia. A U.S. Air Force MC-130 Combat Talon aircraft with a combined Colombian and American PSYOPs team were circling 20 miles from the rescue site. If the mission failed for any reason, the Colombian and American Special Operations Forces would be inserted all around the FARC camp, while the Combat Talon would drop thousands of leaflets calling for a negotiated release of the hostages. As the white Mi-17s approached the FARC camp, Major Russi and Major Davila stood behind the pilots looking out the front cockpit windows. The designated HLZ did not have a bonfire. 400 meters away across the river, they could see numerous FARC guerrillas, but no one was wearing a white T-shirt, and there were no answers to their radio calls. Major Russi had the final say on whether to land or abort. Russi turned to Davila. "We're here, let's do it. Tell the pilots to land. It's game time." The big Mi-17 landed, and the ramp was lowered. The pilots kept their RPMs high, ready for immediate takeoff. If Major Russi said the words, "I lost my wallet," that was the abort signal for the helicopter to immediately lift off and escape. Major Russi immediately exited when the ramp hit the ground, Major Davila right behind him with his video camera. Russi went directly to the closest FARC soldiers, identified himself as the leader of the humanitarian mission, and demanded to be taken to Cesar and meet the hostages. The other team members spread out and greeted the FARC guerrillas, treating them like celebrities. The FARC fighters were surprised by the attention, but it helped allay any suspicions. The medical operatives began querying the guerrillas about any medical ailments, while Major Russi and his cameraman disappeared to find Cesar and the hostages. They had estimated only 10 minutes on the ground, but that 10 minutes was quickly disappearing. As they approached some crude huts, Russi recognized Cesar and went straight to him, introducing himself as Jorge, the mission leader. Russi turned on the charm, even giving Cesar a book on Julius Caesar, but reminding Cesar that time was wasting and the helicopters were limited on the fuel needed to get to Alfonso Cano. Cesar gave the order and the hostages began to appear, herded by FARC guerrillas. The hostages, including the 3 Americans, had been told they'd be meeting with international medical personnel to check on their health, but had only been told about the helicopters just minutes before they heard the approaching Mi-17s. STANSELL was immediately suspicious of the 2 helicopters that lacked any markings from the International Red Cross. As they passed by Major Davila, the Telsur cameraman, many hostages were not happy to provide their names for another proof-of-life video. Some physically fought against being flex-cuffed for the flight. One of the Colombian hostages, John Jario Duran, had been a prisoner for 10 years and had a complete come-apart, refusing to be flex-cuffed. All 3 of the Americans considered Duran to be one of the toughest and most dependable guys. To see Duran lose it was upsetting all the hostages. Keith STANSELL, who had been a prisoner for 5 years, disputed Daniel, one of the humanitarians, who showed him his badge, proving he was Australian. STANSELL grabbed the ID, looking it over. "Bullshit, you're not Australian. You've got a Colombian accent." Daniel stayed calm and said in English, "I'm going to get you out of here. Do you want to go home?" STANSELL immediately shut up and began helping everyone to the helicopters. Major Russi could not convince Cesar to leave his shoulder-holstered pistol behind. Neither would Cesar's bodyguard leave his side on. Nevertheless, they had all the hostages on board, and Russi pushed some cases of non-alcoholic beer off the ramp, along with some boxes of candy, to the bewildered FARC guerrillas who had just unknowingly witnessed a hostage rescue. The Mi-17 took off, and the pilots gave the code word for success. They had been on the ground for 23 minutes, except Cesar and his bodyguard were still armed. The former captives, who did not yet know they were free, noticed Cesar was showing signs of air sickness. The doctors approached him to help, and suddenly Cesar and his bodyguard were surrounded, disarmed, and stripped to their underwear. As the 2 new prisoners were being flex-cuffed, the real hostages were being freed from their bonds and told, "We are Colombian military. You are free." The recovery team began to chant, "Uribe, Uribe, Uribe," and then "Montoya, Montoya, Montoya." The hostages got to their feet, tears of joy on their faces, and began jumping up and down in unison in the helicopter until the pilot had them sit back down as he was having difficulty controlling the helicopter. 30 minutes later, the Mi-17 landed at San Jose de Guaviare. The operation had gone perfectly. 12 Colombians and 3 American hostages were rescued without firing a shot or suffering any injuries. All the newly freed hostages were loaded aboard a Colombian Air Force Fokker F-28 jet for the flight to Tolmedia. They were met there by General Padilla, Minister Santos, and Ambassador Brownfield. Also present were the Deputy Southcom Commander and a mixed group of Colombian and American Special Ops soldiers who had been standing by as the QRF. Major Russi slipped away from the celebration to rejoin his team, whose helicopter had just landed on the other end of the airfield. And so ended what may have been the most perfect hostage rescue operation in history. The now freed hostages returned home to their families, and the rescue team, they received the highest Colombian award for valor, the Orden de Boyaca Gran Cruz. But not everyone had a happy ending. As for the FARC, they finally declared peace with the government of Colombia in 2016 and transitioned into a political party. And this rescue, an epic defeat for their movement, only hastened their end. As for Keith STANSELL, Tom Howe, and Marc GONSALVES, the brotherhood they forged in the jungle of Colombia continues to this day.